Sergio Oliva is one of the most consequential figures in the history of bodybuilding. A three-time Mr. Olympia champion, he remains the only competitor ever to have defeated Arnold Schwarzenegger on that stage. Born in Cuba, he arrived in the United States with almost nothing, and built a legacy that the sport has continued to reckon with for decades. What the standard accounts rarely address is the more complicated story behind that legacy, one that Sergio Oliva Jr., now 41, has only recently begun to discuss openly. The truth about who Sergio Oliva Jr. was as a father, as a husband, and as a private individual is considerably more difficult than the public record suggests. His son has, until now, largely kept that account to himself. What follows is not a conventional bodybuilding story. It is an account of a man who grew up in the shadow of an outsized figure, who inherited both the genetics and the silence, and who has since chosen to build something in that name, not out of reverence but in spite of a complicated history. To understand Sergio Oliva Jr., it is necessary to begin with his father, and to understand his father, it is necessary to begin with Cuba in 1962. Sergio Oliva was born on July 4, 1941, in Guantanamo, Cuba. By the age of 12, he was working alongside his father in sugarcane fields. At 16, his father enrolled him in the Cuban army under Fulgencio Batista's government, where he served against the insurgency led by Fidel Castro. That insurgency succeeded. Castro took power, and Oliva, a young man with exceptional physical ability and limited prospects under the new government, began lifting weights. His development was striking by any measure. After 6 months of training, he was clean and jerking over 400 pounds. Before reaching an age when most of his peers had settled on a direction in life, he had broken 3 Cuban weightlifting records. That ability earned him a place on the Cuban team at the 1962 Central American and Caribbean Games in Kingston, Jamaica. What occurred in Kingston was unexpected. During the competition, while his government handlers were occupied elsewhere, Oliva left his quarters and ran on foot through the streets of Kingston until he reached the American consulate, where he requested political asylum. The consulate granted it. Word reached the other Cuban athletes still competing at the games. Individually and then in groups, they followed. By the end of the episode, 65 Cuban nationals had defected, including the entire weightlifting team and their security detail. The action reportedly drew a sharp response from the Castro government. Oliva arrived in Miami as a registered alien, worked briefly as a television repairman, and relocated to Chicago in 1963 at the recommendation of contacts in the Cuban exile community. Chicago is where his career as a bodybuilder took shape, not in well-equipped facilities, but around a schedule built on 10 to 12-hour shifts at a steel mill, followed by 2.5 hours of training at the Duncan YMCA. That pattern continued, day after day for years. The local bodybuilding community had few points of reference for what they were observing. Reports circulated about a Cuban-born competitor who was lifting beyond the capacity of the local Olympic champions and who carried proportions that did not appear consistent with what the sport had previously produced. At a competition weight somewhere between 225 and 255 pounds, Oliva's waist measured 27 inches. His thighs were reportedly larger in circumference than his waist. His arms measured 22.5 inches flexed. Joe Weider, among the most influential figures in the sport's history, later stated that no one could beat Oliva when he was in condition. Arnold Schwarzenegger, in his autobiography, described seeing Oliva for the first time at a competition and concluding, before either man had stepped on stage, that he was looking at someone he could not defeat. Schwarzenegger wrote that the sheer scale and proportion of Oliva's physique produced that impression immediately and without qualification. That was Sergio Oliva Sr. at his peak. Not simply a successful competitor, but a figure who altered the expectations of everyone around him. Sergio Oliva won the Mr. Olympia title in 1967, becoming only the second man in the contest's history to claim it. He defended it in 1968 so completely that no other competitor entered. His 1968 win remains the only uncontested Mr. Olympia on record. No challenges, no panel deliberation. Oliva stood alone on the stage, and the title was his. In 1969, Arnold Schwarzenegger competed for the title and lost. That defeat stands as the only time in Arnold's Olympia career that he finished second. The man who beat him had been working sugarcane fields in Cuba less than a decade earlier. In 1970, the two met again. Most people present that evening, including many who have spoken about it in the years since, believed Oliva had won. The judges scored it 4-3 in Arnold's favor. Questions about that result have persisted for decades. Among the most frequently reported concerns, that Joe Weider, who had a direct financial interest in Arnold's career, replaced judges at the last minute under circumstances that were never formally explained to Oliva or made public. The 1971 controversy was more straightforward in its mechanics, if no less contested in its implications. Oliva had accepted an invitation to compete in the NABBA Mr. Universe, an event run by a rival federation. The IFBB, which Weider controlled, barred Oliva from that year's Mr. Olympia on the grounds of federation crossover. Arnold Schwarzenegger had competed in that same NABA event the previous year without any disciplinary consequence. With Oliva absent, Arnold competed without his principal rival and won his second consecutive Olympia title. Arnold himself addressed this plainly in his own account of the period, noting that he had coasted to the title, that Sergio was the only man who could have challenged him, and that Sergio had been barred from the contest along with others due to the federation dispute. Oliva was permitted to guest pose at the event, to perform on the same stage on the same night while the man he would otherwise have competed against received the trophy. By 1972, Oliva had trained under Arthur Jones, the designer of Nautilus equipment and a proponent of high-intensity training methods. Accounts from that period describe him arriving at competition in the best condition of his career, a reported 250 pounds in exceptional definition. Arnold later said that Sergio had come back more impressive than he remembered, that his thighs and waist made it difficult for anyone standing next to him to look comparable. The judges still scored it for Arnold. Weider had again changed the judging panel at the last minute. The result followed the same pattern as before. Oliva left the IFBB after that. For roughly a decade, he competed in smaller federations across Europe and Latin America, winning consistently in circuits that carried far less visibility than the organization he had left behind. He returned to the IFBB in 1984 and again in 1985, finishing 8th on both occasions, placements that a number of observers at the time considered inconsistent with what his physique warranted. Before he could attempt another run in 1986, something happened that had nothing to do with competition. In July 1986, Sergio Oliva Jr. was shot 5 times in the abdomen with a .38 caliber handgun at his home. He was 45 years old. He was taken to the hospital in serious condition and survived. The shooter was his wife, Arlene Garrett, a professional bodybuilder, and the mother of their son, Sergio Oliva Jr., who had been born in 1984. Some accounts describe the incident as a struggle over Sergio's service weapon. He was a Chicago police officer at the time during a domestic argument. Other accounts, including descriptions later provided by their son, indicate a household history that extended well beyond a single incident. The Chicago Tribune covered the story at the time under the headline, "Cop Shot in Fight with Wife." Oliva survived. His competitive career and the marriage did not. The couple divorced in 1990. Arlene Garrett later relocated to North Carolina, where she worked as an exercise physiologist and personal trainer. Sergio Oliva Jr. was 2 years old when his father was shot. He was 8 when his father bought a home in Chicago's Rogers Park neighborhood. He spent portions of his childhood in Chicago with his father and portions in Alabama with his mother and his sister Julia. The circumstances of that upbringing, the violence, the instability, the fractured relationship between two people who had a destructive effect on each other, shaped him in ways he has only recently begun to discuss. What stands apart is not simply that Sergio Sr. survived 5 gunshot wounds to the abdomen, it is that he survived and remained, in some form, a presence in his son's life. Not an easy one, and not a nurturing one by most accounts, but present. That fact, and what it meant to grow up in the shadow of it, is the part of this story that Sergio Jr. has described as the most complicated to come to terms with. When Sergio Oliva Jr. began pursuing bodybuilding seriously, his father did not welcome the decision. There was no passing of training wisdom, no shared history from a father who had lived the sport at its highest level. Sergio Oliva Sr. actively discouraged it. In multiple interviews, Sergio Jr. has been candid about this. His father was Cuban, and like many first-generation immigrant parents who had worked their way out of poverty and political repression, Sergio had specific ideas about what his son's future should look like. A doctor, a lawyer, a baseball player, something stable and respectable, something that had nothing to do with the sport he felt had ultimately used him up. Sergio believed bodybuilding had cost him. The politics, the manipulation, the disputed titles, the years consumed by federation conflicts, all of it had worn down whatever affection he once had for the sport. He did not want his son to invest everything into something that could be taken away by a judge with a personal agenda. The friction extended beyond career guidance. In an interview with Muscle and Fitness, Sergio Jr. described his father as broadly unsupportive, not just of bodybuilding, but of most things he pursued. There was no consistent, wholehearted approval. The message, delivered with the emotional restraint of a man not given to directness, came through clearly enough. Whatever you're doing, it isn't what I had in mind. What makes this worth examining is that Sergio Jr. built his physique from a standing start. When he committed to bodybuilding at 18, he stood 6 feet tall and weighed 145 pounds. Nothing about his frame suggested he was the son of the myth. He was not handed a physical advantage. He did not begin with his father's 22-inch arms already in place. He built what he has over years, against his father's open opposition, while being measured continuously against a man who had done something the sport may not see again. He ran track, he swam, he had a scholarship, he could have taken a different path entirely. He chose not to, and for much of that journey, his father was not supporting him. The lack of career support is in many respects something athletes learn to work around. What Sergio Jr. has described in interviews, in carefully measured terms, is harder to set aside. It concerns his mother. Arlene Garrett was not a peripheral figure. She was a competitive bodybuilder, a serious athlete, and a woman who survived a marriage that ended in 1986 when she shot her husband 5 times and then built a new life from that point forward. What took place inside that marriage, the arguments, the violence that the circumstances of that incident suggest ran in multiple directions, has never been fully addressed in public by either party. But Sergio Jr. was present throughout his parents' relationship in the way that children are. He absorbed it. He lived alongside it. And what he witnessed or came to understand about how his father treated his mother left a mark that ran considerably deeper than disagreements over career choices. In 2018, when Sergio Jr. was cast in the film Bigger, a dramatization of the Joe Weider story, he was asked to portray his own father, to wear Sergio Oliva Jr.'s posing trunks, recreate his movements, and inhabit his presence on screen. He did it, by all accounts, convincingly. But in the interviews surrounding the film, what came through was not straightforward pride in honoring a father's legacy. It was something considerably more complicated. He said plainly, "I look like him. I'm not like him at all." That statement is not simply about personality. It is a declaration of identity. Sergio Jr. had spent his adult life being measured against a man who, in his assessment, was not a particularly good father. By the time Bigger was released, he had stopped treating admiration for his father's physique as an endorsement of the man who had it. There is a dynamic that surfaces in coverage of their relationship that illustrates the tension clearly. When fans posted side-by-side comparison photos of a young Sergio Jr. performing his father's signature pose alongside images of Sr. at his competitive peak, Jr. pushed back. The response from those fans was typically dismissive. It's a harmless comparison, nothing more. But his reaction was not really about the photographs. It was about what those comparisons required, setting aside who he actually was and substituting a legacy he had unresolved feelings about. He did not want to be seen as a continuation. He wanted to be seen as a distinct person. That distinction carried weight that went well beyond ego. The frustration visible in those moments was not primarily anger. It was grief taking on a different form. A man working through in public what it meant to carry a name that other people told him to be proud of, without knowing what that name meant in private. Sergio Oliva Jr. arrives at 41 having spoken openly about who his father was, about the complications, the contradictions, and the weight that came with that name. The myth was real. Sergio Oliva Sr. was by any measure the sport applies one of the greatest athletes bodybuilding has ever produced. The genetics were extraordinary, the work ethic was legendary, the competitive spirit was by Arnold Schwarzenegger's own account unlike anything the sport had seen. The courage it took to defect from Cuba, to build a new life from nothing, to compete at a level that made the best in the world feel inadequate, all of that stands and none of it is diminished here. But in recent years, Sergio Jr. has been deliberate about separating the legend from the man. The man didn't want his son to become a bodybuilder. The man left a trail of domestic turmoil that ended with 5 bullets in his stomach, a marriage that collapsed, and 2 children who grew up absorbing the aftermath. By his son's plainly stated assessment, he was not a good father, not in any tabloid sense but in the simpler, more fundamental sense that his love, whatever form it took, did not translate into the presence and support a son needs from a father. "I look like him, I'm not like him at all." That sentence, offered in an interview about a film in which Sergio Jr. had to put on his father's identity and perform it for a camera, is the whole story in 8 words. He carried the genetics, he did not inherit the character. He made a deliberate choice to be different in the ways that mattered most. What remains is something genuinely substantial. A 41-year-old man still competing, still pursuing the Olympia title his father was arguably denied multiple times, but doing so with a clarity about his own identity that Sergio Sr. never quite reached. Sergio Jr. knows what the name means in bodybuilding history. He also knows what that name meant at the dinner table, in the house, in the moments that cameras and trophies and magazine covers never captured. And he has decided at 41, after Dubai, after the jail cell, after the comeback, after years of being asked to reflect a man he never fully knew, to stop letting others define what that name means. It means him now. It means a man who started at 145 pounds and built something real. A man who survived the worst year of his life in a foreign jail cell and came back to finish 3rd at a professional show. A man who trained under Dorian Yates, who spoke about philosophy and growth. A man who could play his father in a film and still say without apology that he is not his father.